Hi, good morning. My name is Jayne Graham, and I'd really like to welcome you this morning to our webinar, The Business of Charity, and we're going to be talking about how social value also possibly brings economic gain. I'm the Commercial Director of Citizens Advice Gateshead and the Director of our trading subsidiary, Society Matters Community Interest Company. And I'll be your host today for what I'm sure will be an interesting and thought-provoking discussion. Before we go on to introduce today's panel, I thought it would be useful to just start with a very brief synopsis of our first webinar, during which we uncovered some of the many reasons that the charity order book is always full, or as it was concluded in the discussion, is overflowing. The panel concluded that this was due to an ever-growing need, simultaneous to ever-diminishing public services, with the charity sector stepping up to fill the gap. But without the money flowing to enable that to happen. It was also concluded that philanthropy was identified as having shifted from improving people's basic quality of life to now simply helping people to get the very basics they need to survive. And the time spent by the community and voluntary sector on competing to access funds is both disproportionate and wasteful. I'll leave it there. If you'd like to hear the first discussion in full and draw your own conclusions from that debate, you can find a recording on the Citizens Advice Gateshead website in our news pages. So on to webinar 2. We move on to another dimension of the business of charity. As I said, that social value actually brings economic gain. But first, it's our absolute pleasure to be joined today by James Ramsbotham, and who is chair of Newcastle Building Society and former CEO of North East England Chamber of Commerce, and Stephen Bell, CBE, Chief Executive of Gateshead-based charity Changing Lives, along with Alison Dunn, Chief Executive of Citizens Advice Gateshead, and Barry Taylor, the charity's Chair of Trustees. So first, James, thank you very much for joining us. As someone who has a rich background in diverse areas, including banking, the armed forces, and of course supporting economic growth through the business sector in the North East region, how have you been involved in the business of charity?
Well, I mean, I've been involved as a trustee and a patron of a number of charities and various things like that. But I think that what has driven me, and it's sort of as important as what I've actually done, is where I feel we sit with charity and business here in the North East. And I'm very conscious, and this was brought home to me when we did the 200th anniversary of the Chamber back in 2015, and looking back at what the Chamber had achieved over those 200 years, and particularly picking up on the fact that in the early part of that, there was a huge amount of philanthropy here in the North East. And indeed, we still look around and see in much of our built environment and many of the charitable institutions that we've got around the region, how they were set up by the business community at that time. But over the last 200 years, in a number of small steps, we've increasingly sort of almost delegated responsibility for looking after our fellow citizens to the public sector. And we've indeed, the Chamber helped set up things like Newcastle City Council and other organisations around the region that have helped then pick up the burden of that. And I'm very conscious that where we sit today, we sit in a region which actually is one of the most charitable when it comes to giving of any part of the United Kingdom, but it tends to be on a personal basis. And on the corporate side, on the business side, we're actually not so good. We seem to have sort of allowed us to feel that the public sector does that. And I think that your point that you just made about really where philanthropy now sits is looking after the more basic needs than really adding. And you look at what philanthropy did, 150, 200 years ago, you find sort of, village cricket grounds, village swimming pools, schools being set up, which were much more for the sort of wider cultural and physical enjoyment of people, rather than just helping people make ends meet. And I think now businesses are becoming more aware of that, but actually we need to pull together across the charitable and the business communities so much better to help people actually just live a better quality of life. And by having that richer community, help everybody in so many other ways, which I'm sure we'll come on to. And it's certainly something that we focused on within the Chamber. And I know that, I'm just starting in the Newcastle Building Society, but we're so good at doing exactly that.
Absolutely, thank you. And in fact, Stuart Fern from also from Newcastle Building Society will be joining us on in our final webinar in a couple of weeks' time, where we're talking very much about the sort of how business and charity can work together to develop those mutual partnerships you're talking about. Thanks, James. That's a great starting point. So, Stephen, welcome to you also. I understand your finance background led you to your current role with Changing Lives, formerly Cyrenians, where you've been for an impressive 26 years. It would be great to know a bit about the work of Changing Lives and whether the findings from our first webinar resonate with you at all.
Yeah, I do. And interesting what James has just said. Changing Lives was set up in 1970 by 4 people who were concerned of those that were sleeping rough in Newcastle. 2 of those came directly from the business community, 2 come from public services. So actually, we wouldn't be here today without the sort of interest of those within the private sector to set us up. Changing Lives now operates from Westminster to Norwich to Peterborough and as far up as Berwick. We employ over 700 people. We've got a turnover of over 30 million. And my background, I left school at 16. I went to work at Go Ahead Northern. I went and did all of the back office for Go Ahead Northern when it was going through nationalisation into private ownership. And at the time, I didn't realise, but I learned an awful lot. Ended up being a middle management accountant. And what happens in those days is everything got pushed out to the regions and then brought back in. When it did, I got made redundant. And the guy who was the company secretary at the Cyrenians offered us the job. Started work on the Monday and I got interviewed on the Wednesday. I made the joke of the good old days before the HR departments took over the world, but that's how I got in. And the initial bit about it was, didn't have a computer, everything was handwritten, and everything had come from quite a corporate environment into something which wasn't there. I've been chief exec now for about 17 years and we had 42 staff. But the heart of the organisation and what it was in 1970 to what it is today is exactly the same. It's about believing that people actually come into Changing Life services, not by their own fault, by what happened to somebody else. And we talk a lot about childhood dreams. So when I was growing up, I wanted to be a cricketer. I played for Durham, but I wasn't quite good enough, or a policeman. But in them days, you had to have good eyes, and I had my eyes lasered, but I had bad eyes. Couldn't get in. So I never foresaw my journey coming to do what I'm doing. And nobody thinks when they're a young person, oh, I'll tell you what I want to do. I want to go into Changing Life service.
Yeah.
Our job's to give them back their dreams. That's what our staff do day in, day out. We operate as a business, and we'll get into this later on. And I think current climate gives us more challenges than I've ever had in all my time in the charity sector. And what you have to do at the moment is operate and think much more like a private company. Otherwise, the future is going to be a very daunting one.
Thanks. That's really interesting, Stephen, and we will go on to find out more about the sort of the mechanics of how you do manage that within Changing Life, which is obviously a very large charity. Thanks for that. So can I just mention to our audience today that you can actually ask questions through the question facility on your chat panel. Please do put questions to the panel, and I will do my best to field those to people as we move forward. So I'm now going to introduce Alison Dunn and Barry Taylor, but before I do that, I just thought if we're sort of starting to tackle the question of social value bringing economic gain, I'd just provide a little bit of context. So according to the UK Civil Society Almanac, which is produced by NCVO, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, the charitable sector is estimated to have contributed around 20 billion to the UK economy last year. That represents just under 1% of GDP and employs just short of 1 million people. This economic impact is over and above, obviously, the social value created by the charitable sector. Social value being classified in terms of the value placed on the charity by its direct recipients, so the people it's helped, but also the indirect value to others in the community, donors, and the benefits to the millions of volunteers who deliver charity services, who gain as well as give as volunteers. So I'd like to move on to introduce Alison Dunn, who, like Stephen, is Chief Exec, Chief Executive of Citizens Advice Gateshead, one of the 169,000 charities that are registered in the UK. Alison, I've been looking at the stats for Citizens Advice Gateshead, and it looks to me like there's a pretty clear economic contribution from the charity. I thought it would be useful for you to be able to talk us through some of the headlines for the last 18 months.
I certainly will, but before I do that, Stephen, I just want to say what a wonderful thing to be giving people their dreams back. That's just a really great vision to have. It's touched my heart. But in terms of the economic value that Citizens Advice Gateshead brings, over the last 18 months, we've supported 15,000 clients to acquire overall financial gains of almost £11.5 million. And this is specific to Gateshead. When we look at the Citizens Advice Network overall, and there are just, I think, around 300 local citizens advisors, these figures are in the billions. So just in Gateshead alone, we've achieved financial gains of £11.5 million. And within that, there's 9 million, which is real money that goes into people's pockets. So it's not some fancy social action multiplier, it's real money that goes into people's pockets. It comes from the income maximisation work that we do, or from the debt management work that we do. But this money is money that's spent in the local economy. And we know that when money is spent in the local economy, it creates even greater community wealth. So we're very fortunate to be part of the National Citizens Advice Network, and as a result, they have some fairly sophisticated economic modelling that tells us that the savings that our work in Gateshead provides to local government is over 3 million. That's more than 5 times their return on the investment that's made in our service. And this comes from the work that we do around prevention of homelessness, the evictions that we help people to avoid, the family breakdown, working through problem debt, etc., which, you know, includes things like council tax debt, which is really important to the income of a local authority. But beyond the local economy of Gateshead, we know, because of the modelling that our national organisation has done for us, that the total savings to the NHS is estimated to be as much as 7.5 million in Gateshead. So our work reduces GP time, it reduces repeat prescriptions, it reduces presentations at accident and emergency. But beyond this, for the Department of Work and Pensions, our work saves them a staggering £30 million in Gateshead alone. The work that we do around checking eligibility, making sure that forms are completed correctly, challenging decisions, reducing absences from work, the list goes on. So you'll see, as a charity, we're really clear on the economic value that we bring to Gateshead, but actually beyond that, there's the wider public value of improving clients' well-being. And when we talk about well-being, we're talking about their emotional well-being, their state of happiness, their relationships, and their positive functioning and participation in society. All of this feeds into public value, and we know, because our national membership body tells us, that this is close to £245 million in Gateshead when we factor in productivity at work and participation in society. Now, we can talk about those big level numbers, and they are huge, but actually, as a local charity, the thing that I feel is really worth crowing about is the 9 million that goes into people's pockets, because we know that that's the engine for the local economy, helping us to broaden out our social values still further. So I think for this conversation, that's the starting position, Jayne.
Thanks, Alison. Barry, as Chair of Trustees of Citizens Advice, it would be good to hear your thoughts on what Alison set out there. But before you answer, I thought it would be useful to ask the audience, is the economic impact that's been described so far more than you would have expected, less than you would have expected, or did you have no expectations? It's not something you've thought about before. So a poll should actually arrive on your screen now. And if you would like to select your preferred choice, and then Barry, if I can ask you to respond to those results and talk to us about Citizens Advice Gateshead's contribution, both social and economic. How are we doing? Has everybody voted there? Okay, I think we're just about done there. 70% of you, that was more than expected, and 20% no expectation, and 10% less than expected. So Barry, your thoughts on that, and on the sort of what Alison has told us so far?
Well, I think my response to that, Jayne, is I'm not surprised. That the perception, people aren't aware of just what the value is, and I think I mean that's due to a lot of reasons, I'm sure, but I think a lot of people's experience of charity is directly related to their own personal engagement. Mm-hmm. And although over half the population volunteer to do different things at different times, unless you're actually personally involved and you've got a cause that you're actually committed to, I think people's perception and understanding of just what charities are doing and how it adds value is still somewhat lacking. I mean, it's very, very interesting, to hear what Alison's saying, particularly about the impact of what we're doing at Citizens Advice in Gateshead and how that, circulates around the local community in economic terms and social value terms. I mean, I do think the role of charities now is, charities have always been the glue that's held society together, in my view. But I think picking up on one of the points that James was making at the beginning, I think there's been a shift, a very clear shift now that this glue is the thing that's actually sort of stopping people from falling over the edge, rather than being the driver for innovation and lots of additional creative things that I mean, quite clearly those things still do happen. But, if you look at the work that we do, if you look at the work that Stephen's organisation does, we're dealing with people now who are coming to us who have been failed by the system effectively. There is a system there that is supposed to sort of support, help in lots of different ways. But the charitable sector now increasingly is having to be a facilitator, the means by which people actually access what the public sector is supposed to provide. And I think whilst that's an absolutely important role that we play, I think it is a bit of a shame really that we're almost working on the back foot now rather than being able to be a lot more proactive and creative, which is where the charity sector is always particularly well.
Thanks, Barry. So yeah, I think we probably move on now then to talk. So there are obviously various aspects of recovery that we and phases that we are in now post-COVID, and generally as an economy. James, what role do you believe, if we're talking about charities can contribute economic benefit? What role do you believe charities could play in the economic recovery of the North East, and what's getting in the way of that?
Well, I would just start by just cautioning against using the phrase post-COVID. I'm not sure.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Fair comment.
We were just saying at the start that we seem to know more people with it at the moment than we have at any time over the last 18 months. Right. And I do think actually we all have a responsibility to make sure that people don't feel complacent and keep their guard up. But clearly, there are a lot of things happening within the economy that we need to be conscious of. Curiously, Stephen and I were having a catch up on something else this morning, and both sharing the fact that the biggest issue facing all of us and it's all sectors is actually a manpower resource at the moment, and how right the way across every single employer is struggling to find the people that they need to work. And of course, one of the great roles that the charitable sector play is by helping people back into work in a whole variety of ways. And so many people have so many complex needs, and you certainly speak to Stephen in detail if you ever have the opportunity about some of the really complex issues that his service users face, bringing them from where they are back into a place where not only can they contribute to the economy and participate, so from a sort of selfish employer's perspective, but actually fulfill their dreams and you know, turn their lives around. So it's, as ever, there's a double whammy of getting this right. But it's why you know, right now, for all sorts of reasons, be it Brexit related or COVID related, we're really, really short of people, and employers can't do this themselves. It is desperate that the charitable sector, and it's the same whether it's citizens' advice focusing on people's financial woes, or something like Stephen facing, you know, addiction and all sorts of other problems that keep people from the workplace, or at least burden them in such a way that they can't contribute fully, both for the benefit of the economy, but also for them as individuals to play a full part in society.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I just want to come to a question has been asked by Leslie Telford. Have statistics been shared with local and central government? And if so, is there overriding, what is their overriding response or acknowledgement? Alison, do you want to comment on that?
So, I mean, it won't be news to you to hear that local government has got some fairly significant issues and has done for some time. So they're absolutely supportive of the work of Citizens Advice Gateshead. They have funded us for many, many years. But their support of the charitable sector overall is restrained by the financial envelope in which they're working within. So in Gateshead alone, there's been £120 million taken out of the Gateshead economy in terms of public sector funding, with another 65 million to come. So they absolutely value what the charitable sector has to offer, but their ability to fund at the levels that they have done in the past is severely curtailed by the economic environment in which they're operating.
Thanks,
Can I
Alison.
come in there, James, because what happens then?
Yes.
So authorities have been getting reduced funding. So what happens is when you've got contracts to deliver a service, that gets reduced funding. You've then got external pressures put on the charitable sector currently, which is going to be wage inflation, which is just out of control. You've got increased national insurance coming through. What you've got is a diminishing envelope coming through from public services. So the pressure on the squeeze which is coming into those delivering services is what they're expecting to do is more for less. We're expecting to do that 10 years ago. You can't keep doing this. And we're looking really strongly at the moment, and I've got meetings tomorrow as to whether or not we actually start handing contracts back, which we can't deliver anymore, because A, they're not safe for staff, particularly when we've got the levels of vacancies we've got. And the pressure externally, and just touching what Barry said, I thought a few years ago, Barry, we could change the world. So I thought. And then you learn you can't. You're actually just part of the system. And you're actually a small cog within the system. So when you've got things like the chair of the Charity Commission saying that charities shouldn't be out there advocating and actually speaking on behalf of the people using our services, nothing really gets you more angry than this. You know, that's why the charity sector's there. We're there to look after somebody. It's our right to do this. So when you've got, you know, interest rate this morning's got up to 4.2%, we can't do a thing about that. So not only are it's impacting on the services, it also impacts on the staff team who've got growing costs on the wages that they take.
Yeah, the ability for us to renegotiate the payment terms on which, you know, contracts and grants, which in some cases are 5-10 years old, is negligible, and you know, we're being squeezed at both ends.
So we're firing some debate in the audience at the moment. So so how do we as a VCSE influence and change the systems within which we work? That's Abby Conway's asked that question. Any thoughts on that?
Well, for me, I think we have to keep campaigning. We have to keep, you know, sort of raising awareness of, you know, not only the issues that are affecting the people that we serve, but also, as Stephen points out, you know, the challenges that are being faced by the sector itself. I mean, to some extent, I think the charity sector is almost a victim of its own success, because the one thing about charities is that they're very agile, they're very adaptive, you know, they're very used to digging deep, and the very people who are often the backbone of charities, you know, are the very people who will put up with immense hardship, you know, immense personal deprivation to ensure that they deliver the service that their audience is in need of. And it almost, you almost get a sense at times that that's almost taken for granted, you know, by central government and perhaps to some extent local government, you know, this belief that, well, you know, I know it's tough, whatever happens, these people will come through, because that's what they always do. And indeed, I'm sure we will continue to do that. But when you're faced with some of the very, very, you know, perhaps physical constraints that Stephen described, you know, there is a point beyond which, you know, maybe even the charitable sector won't be able to continue to deliver in the way it has done in the past.
Thanks, Barry. I think it's really interesting. In the last discussion, I asked the question, what would happen if the charitable sector shut shop tomorrow? Who would fill the gap? And the general response was the charity sector, because it would recreate itself, because that gap cannot be there. So it's an interesting one, isn't it? James, do you have any thoughts on this in terms of the, you know, what can the VCSC sector do to avoid this chasm that's now growing in terms of the public services that the charity sector is now filling?
Well, I think there are various things, but probably the thing that I would focus on first is trying to often see the world through a different set of eyes. And I think there's a real need to encourage the business community to do ever more. You know, it is where this all began, and I think that there's a lot more that the charitable sector just should try and, it's very easy to get focused on the great work that whatever charitable organization is doing, what it's doing, how it goes about it. But sometimes just taking a couple of paces back and looking at what it does from the wider perspective. And today here we're focusing on the economic impact. And actually, charities often are having a massive impact on the broader economy and broader society around them, but aren't necessarily emphasizing that particular aspect. And at a time when everybody is facing particular challenges more than they've faced necessarily in recent years, they need to sort of understand that actually that working with the charitable sector can achieve so much more, and it will have benefit to them. So, you know, for example, the work that Citizens Advice does actually means that a lot of businesses who otherwise might be facing bad debts might actually find ways to secure their future as well by helping you do your job better, to help educate people to do the wider piece. And so it's down to the charity to effectively, by looking at it through a different lens, work out how it is to really appeal to the business community and indeed to others as to why it matters so much more that they should work together and support things, because actually it's not, we're not all working in silos, we don't all benefit individually, there's so much more that we can do by working together. And I think that's what I would encourage the voluntary and charitable sector to do more, is really emphasize why businesses can support, because the impact on the broader economy will benefit everybody, and therefore why it would be a valuable thing for the business community to do to support more.
Can I come in on that point, Jayne?
Yes, you can, certainly, Alison.
Yes, so just building on what James has said there. So if we think about the beneficiaries of our service, the fact that, you know, we're supporting carers, we're supporting people who are experiencing difficulties in relationships, people with debt, people who have got, you know, whose homes are at risk. The idea that these people are not sitting in businesses, going into work every day with all of these problems weighing down on them is just ridiculous. You know, the 1 in 2 people who come in and use our service are people who are in work. We are not a service for, you know, we're a service for everyone, and that includes people who are in work. So it is important that we look at our relationship with business through a different lens. We think about how we support people who are in work, but also that business looks at charity sector differently as well. So as I say, you know, our beneficiaries are in their workforces. It's ludicrous to suggest otherwise. But the other thing I think for our network to consider is the way that we're currently structured probably isn't the most economical way of doing business in the future. And I realise that that's controversial, but we have, you know, 260 local citizens advisors across the country. Is that the best way for this service to be organised? Is it economical? Probably not. But then also looking for innovative ways to work in local government. So in my own case, I am of course the Chief Officer of Citizens Advice, but I'm also have a dual role working as a service director in local government and helping local government to understand and value the voluntary sector in an entirely different way. So there's all sorts of innovations, but the one thing that's key to them all is charity on its own simply can't succeed. It has to work differently with its key stakeholders.
Thanks, Alison. So the how of that, because it's, you know, we've concluded that there needs to be a significant shift in terms of relationships between charity and business. The how, we hope, will be covered in our next webinar in a couple of weeks' time, because that's very much the principle of that. And we have people who are involved in that panel who are going to explain their experiences of that and hopefully give us some useful tools to be able to apply. One of the things that we have discussed, and it's something that comes out of what James has said, and Stephen and yourself, Alison, really is around campaigning and making sure that people know the value that charity is bringing. And that actually one of the points that has been raised in the discussion here from the audience is the difficulty with campaigning is how to get funding for it, because in response to what you were saying, that the contracts that we need to deliver have specific outcomes and are restricted in terms of delivery. So is there a discussion point for delivery versus campaigning for change? And this was something that did emerge in the last discussion, that actually I was thinking about it. Well, you know, it's almost trying to unlock that money box is like trying to play search for the key, because, you know, we're all spending an awful lot of time trying to find it, trying to find the key for the box to get the money to be able to deliver on the demand. So it's a really key point for us. Just going back to James's point, Leslie Telford's raised, she agrees with James in terms of getting people back into work and given the complexity of many of those being supported. Do we feel there's a model in place to create a safe environment for people to re-enter the market and not fail? And I thought we'd, Stephen, I'd hand to you on this point, because obviously you mentioned before you started talking about the work, obviously, of changing lives, the charity. And what is your thought on that? Is there a safe environment for people to re-enter, almost the sort of be financially included without failing?
Yeah, mentioned before about the charity sector and what would happen if it wasn't here. People that come into changing lives only come in because of the services that failed them. Most people coming in have got trauma. They either come through probation and probation hasn't worked. They'll come through the police and the police hasn't worked. Come through the housing providers, they haven't worked. So what happens is we're the lowest common denominator. So it's sort of like the last leg where people have got. So it's a little bit like it should go back into public service, but public service can't deal with the complexity we're dealing with. The bit with getting people back into employment, we employ over 700 staff, 20% of those should employ over 700 staff, for competitive yanks, as it is. 20% of those are people who've formerly used our services or somebody else's. It's been a journey. It started when I first got to know James in 2006 with the self-build unit in the West End of Newcastle. It's grown to we've now got people at a service level and at senior levels, so it's not just frontline jobs. What has to happen is you have to rip up the rule book. So, you know, I mentioned my friends in HR again, you know, you need to have people who actually understand that people will have difficulties. People may relapse, but don't we all? So it's a case of working with people. So there is safe environments for people to come back into. And what we do is a model we've got. But again, if we're going to get funding is when we work with external employers, and some of these are Royal Mail, PwC, Carillion, funny enough, used to be a really good one, and Marks and Spencer's, we work with a job coach. So the job coach goes in, they work with the individual who's getting the job. You also work with the employer for up to 6 months and they taper off. So it's actually, because it's difficult sometimes for the employer and the employee, and that person's there as a mentor really for the two of them to ensure there's a safe passage into employment and then away. Because we don't want people with changing lives forever. We want them away, living independently and flourishing.
What's your thoughts on that, Barry? Because obviously you spent 30 years in the probation service, so I would imagine this is something that's been very much in your day-to-day.
Absolutely, and you know, Stephen makes a good point. You know, I mean, we're all only human, you know, and there's very few of us, I think, who can sit back and say that they've never made a mistake in their lives, you know, they've never put a foot wrong. And I think that there is an element of, you know, trying to get employers to accept that, you know, not everybody is perfect, and certainly some people need a bit more support than others. I mean, as Stephen's mentioned, you know, some employers are much more open to it than others. But I think particularly in the current climate, and again, picking up one of the points that Jayne was making, you know, when there are so many staff vacancies around, and there are people out there who, you know, do need work and who, with support and guidance, could make a valuable contribution. Seems to me like an ideal opportunity really to try and win a few more friends and to sort of bring a few more people on board. But as ever, it takes examples, you know, they need to be encouraged. You know, they need to see that in fact it can actually work, and there are some really, you know, incredible examples around. One of the other aspects though that I think, you know, is worth mentioning, which can be a useful stepping stone to enable people to get back into the workplace, is the role of volunteering. And you know, that's a really incredible way of actually sort of helping people to, you know, understand what's expected of them, you know, through their role in an organisation, but also provides them with that safe place where they can fall and still be gathered up and supported again and helped. And you know, volunteering can help in so many ways, you know, building confidence, developing skills, knowledge, and which all, you know, can contribute massively to their sort of place in the work environment.
Thanks, and thanks,
Jayne,
Barry.
can I just come in on a couple of things there, because picking up on both of those, and first of all, going to Stephen's point, when he and I first met with the project that Changing Lives did to build an extension to their place in the West End, where what we effectively set out to do was, and this is about, you know, how you can actually double the value of what you do if you are clever with it. And I'm going to tell the story to spare Stephen's blushes, because it was completely his idea, and he's far too modest. But effectively, Stephen got some money to build an extension, and rather than just going out and finding a construction firm to come and build it, proposed the idea whereby we would actually work together to train up some of his service users in quite a challenging way, but so that they would do the work themselves. And I can tell you that you know, it took longer, it was a tougher job to do, but the opportunity to have that double impact, because we still delivered the project on time, in budget and all the rest of it, but actually we made a difference by changing those people's lives. And the important bit that I will never ever forget was when we did the formal opening, and thank God Stephen didn't ask me to speak straight after the individual, but he asked one of the people that had been involved and part of the project to speak. And Stuart was a man in his mid-40s who basically told the story of how the 12 months that he'd spent on this project was pretty much the longest time that he'd been out of jail since his late teens, the longest time he'd been off drugs since his mid-teens, but most importantly, and this is the answer to your question from my perspective, the first time in his life that he'd found any self-respect or any friendship. And actually, you know, you ask if the culture's right to sort of take hold of these people. What we saw there was a transformation of somebody, and not just the difference that it made to him, and literally totally the first time in your life to remember finding friendship is huge. But the pride that our employees at Esh Group at the time felt by helping those individuals to that space. And you know, I know that you've done some work with James Timpson, and of course the incredible work that they do with ex-offenders, many of whom wouldn't be touched by other employers, but he's developed the most incredible culture that embraces them. And one of my favourite sayings is that what defines a civilized society is the way it looks after its weaker citizens. But what I've also found is that it's the same for businesses, and they don't just want all the same people, all with the same physical and mental abilities or whatever. Actually, having some people who arrive slightly as wounded birds, and the business picks up and turns around and works together with charities to transform, actually transforms the culture of that employer as well. And it's also a lesson for the charitable sector that there's a real need not to treat people as though they just need handouts. It's actually about how you do much more than that. It's the old thing of give someone a fish and feed them for a day, but teach them to fish and feed them for life. But that needs everyone working together. And so that culture absolutely exists. It's not as good in some employers as it is in others, but actually going down this step often has really positive impacts on the culture, and therefore make sure that the ability to provide a safe place for those people is absolutely there and endures and in fact improves.
I mean, just to pick up on that, James, I mean, over many years, one of the things that I used to see time and time again in the probation service, and is people who actually manage to get things through hard effort themselves, who manage to sort of get onto the a job or whatever it is, are quite often the very people who will work the hardest to keep it, because they do value and appreciate the support they've been given and the place that they've managed to reach. But of course, not everybody gets there without stumbling along the way, and that's one of the critical issues really, is about making sure that when they do stumble, it isn't a quick exit out the side door, but it's that pick them up and to help them.
It's really important.
Alison,
Yeah, so we can have a social impact by creating a project of infrastructure. Of course we can, and that social impact can be either negative or positive. But where the social value comes in is in the how we do it. So, Stephen and James have just described there how they turned what was an infrastructure, a sort of a project, into something that delivered real social value by employing people from their client group. And I think as a charity, there's lessons for us all that we mustn't assume just because we do charitable work and we have beneficiaries that we are maximising our social value. It's about how we do it, not just the services that we provide. So for example, who are we getting our stationery from? Who are our cleaning contractors? In Citizens Advice, for example, we have employed adults with learning disabilities to provide our cleaning and maintenance. So that's completely separate from the beneficiaries and the services that we provide. But how do you do business as a charity, and where do you bring in the social value over and above the services that you deliver to your beneficiaries? And the project that James and Stephen have just talked about is a really great example of that. But we mustn't conflate social impact and social value, that they're two quite different things.
Thanks, Alison. A point from Michelle Brannan from Business in the Community, who says hello. Basically to let you know that Business in the Community has a new programme, Skills Exchange, with business volunteers supporting organisations and job coaching through skilled mentoring, and is keen to talk about how that can actually contribute to both Changing Lives and Citizens Advice Gateshead's work. So that's really positive. Thanks for that, Michelle. I'm just going to move on to, obviously we're talking about financial inclusion here, we're talking about impact. I'd like to go back to this point about charities being businesses, and some of the points that Stephen started to talk about before in terms of the realities of managing contracts and actually what that means in monetary terms. I thought we could perhaps explore that a little bit further. I was thinking we've given these webinars, the whole series, the title, The Business of Charity, and it was really interesting. I looked for a definition of business. I mean, I've worked in business for many decades, and when I was looking at definitions, it was all about basically profit was central to qualifying whether there was a business or not. And it's interesting because I always sort of would say that I know that many people wouldn't want to set up a business where they've got a full order book and there's no profit and nobody's going to pay for the services. So I thought we'd have a bit of an audience poll first. Can you be a business if you don't make a profit? Yes, no, or don't know. And while you're doing that, we'll then move on to talk about the sort of behind the scenes business of the charity. And I thought we'd start with you, Stephen, on this. So we'll just let people vote. Can you be a business if you don't make a profit? Yes, no, don't know. We might have convinced you to have a different stance at the beginning. We should probably have asked this earlier. So just a second for people to vote. Okay, so if we can just have a look at the results there. 76% say no and 24% no. Sorry, 76% yes for 24% no. Interesting. At least no one sat on the fence. So Stephen, you're leading a £32 million turnover charity with 1,000+ staff. I guess that feels quite like a business. But you don't make a profit. How do you make the economics work for changing lives?
Where do you want to start? We admit it, we're here to provide social value to the people using our services. So the whole aim of us is to work with individuals as their life. That's what the frontline staff do. Our role is exec, behind the scenes with trustees and ones on the call here today, to make sure the mechanics of the charity are actually enabled to be able to take us forward. We're currently in the eye of a storm, and I think a lot of charities up and down the country are, and I'm really interested to get the views of others. So what you've got is a diminishing public sector, so you've got diminishing contracts. Alison mentioned some of the contracts we've had 5 years, the envelope hasn't changed. What we've currently got now is wage inflation, which is out of control. So we're losing a number of staff. I've lost the young person in central office doing a role, 21 grand. They left 2 weeks ago, go for 27, 28 in the private sector. We can't compete with that. Right, good luck to that. It's a massive increase there, just going. So we're currently operating at 23.2% unemployment or vacancies. That's what we've got. Just then putting the strain on the front line. And we're going back to the councils and talking to the councils about them, they're pleading poverty. So we can't increase that. We've got 1.5% increase coming through on national insurance. And you've got coming through the increase in utility bills next year, which when you run residential projects, there's an impact on that. On top of us, which is where it really gets into more of a commercial game, we've got loans through our bank. We've got something called a covenant. So the bank make a profit a year of over $500,000, and our cash has got to go up by $500,000. So in some ways, we are actually governed by the bank. So we're instructing us that we have to do this. I'm going to have the word covenant on my tombstone. That's what I've said to everybody. By the time I leave this place, I'm going to get rid of these loans because we can't have an external company trying to run the business. We've now got the situation with new contracts. You know, the old compact agreement is completely gone. What happens is Middlesbrough Council, their contracts 3 months in arrears. Ministry of Justice, we just mentioned it before with Barry. So we're the largest provider of women's services in the country in the new MOJ contracts. Sounds great. 2.7 million. It is paid a month in arrears on receipt of invoice, which means it's 2.5 months in arrears. And what we've done is we pay our partners up front. So the cash flow of this means that you're constantly behind in your cash flow of a business. So what you have to have is professional people behind the scenes ensuring that your cash is adequate, you can run this like a business, and the only way you can survive as a charity to deliver the service we want to is to ensure we operate fully as a business. I think the larger change in lives has got, the more bureaucratic it's got. I don't think it needs to be. I think there's fat within the centre that we can remove, and we will be, to enable the frontline services. All this is about enabling the services we're providing to continue going. So with the pressures we've got from the external world, wage inflation, national insurance contribution rises, public sector decreasing, and the cash flow which goes with that, mean that as a charity, you have to operate as a business. And if you can't operate as a business, you won't be in here in 12 months' time.
Thanks, Stephen.
I could
Any
go on,
thoughts on that? Well, that's fair enough. Here's your opportunity. James, do you have any response to that? Obviously, as someone who's been very active in the business community, reflecting what Stephen's saying in terms of, you know, that the harsh realities of running a large charity very much aligned to those of the business.
I think the very best chief executives of charities absolutely think about running their organisation as a business, and I put Stephen at the absolute top of that pinnacle, and it's why he's been as successful as he has and built Changing Lives to be the force that it is. And I think he's absolutely right. You know, the economic impacts on a charity are no different to those on a business. It's just that it's really important. It's almost harder for charities to sort of pull back from their charitable purposes and be commercial about being able to deliver their services. And, you know, there's a bit of middle ground here as well. The Chamber of Commerce that I ran for 15 years is it's not for profit, but it doesn't distribute its profits because it's owned by its members, and it's been around for 200 plus years for a very good reason. But it doesn't aim to make profits to distribute to shareholders or indeed to pay people more, but in order to be able to continue what it does to support the business community more. And in order to do that, it needs to be commercial and needs to maintain a really successful business so that it'll be here for the next 200 years and be there. And that's exactly the role that good charities need to do as well. And it's understanding that being commercial is not uncharitable. In fact, it's the way to make sure that you can continue your charitable purpose.
Thanks, James. Yes, I have personal experience of the challenge that I had from people when I joined Citizens Advice Gateshead, a charity, as the commercial director, and was questioned as to how can that be. Well, this is why that can be. We have a couple of comments and a question. I'm going to pose this to Barry and Alison, whichever wants to go first, if I may. Pat Richardson has said she would argue that all these organisations need to generate surplus in order to survive, and does profit equate with surplus? Charities are asked to have reserves. They need these to cover change situations and to invest in their people. Stephen's talking about this. A key thing is about how much surplus and how that can be made. But then the next point, which sort of presents more of a question really to you that builds on that very nicely. Catherine Marchant has said that she'd be interested in people's views about profit. In every charity she's led, she always wanted to make a surplus. However, obviously this didn't go to pay for expensive offices or company cars. Instead, it allowed us to do more of what we were doing for beneficiaries. Basically, it was profit without shareholders. Every charity should operate as a business. They all have targets and bottom lines. Alison, Barry, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we absolutely need to make a surplus, of course we do. You know, the unrestricted income that we generate gives us the choices about the sorts of services that we deliver. So as James has just articulated, our profit does not get distributed to shareholders or to members, it goes back into services. But the reason why that surplus is perhaps more important to us even than securing grants and contracts is that it enables us to do the things that are important to us. So we're very much driven in the charity sector by the funding opportunities that are available to us, and you do your very best to ensure that you're only going after opportunities that reflect your vision and your mission. But the reality is that sometimes the stuff that we want to do that is not supported by grants, trusts, commissioners, philanthropists, etc. So generating that surplus, that profit, however you want to describe it, allows us to do the things that are important to us. So we absolutely do need to deliver a surplus, and that will get reinvested in the things that are really important to us.
Thanks, Alison. Barry?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, just yesterday we were having this conversation within the charity, and this balance between restricted and unrestricted income is quite an interesting, you know, sort of issue really, because the restricted income usually comes with different funding sources and is there to provide a specific service, and we usually measured against that, and quite rightly so. The unrestricted income is the surplus or the profit, which, as Alison says, we can use to sort of focus on things that we want to do, that we probably identify locally are particularly important to us. But the ability to sort of build up reserves and have that unrestricted income is becoming more and more of a challenge for all the reasons that Stephen's outlined. The drain on what little surplus we have, through other things, the pressure is becoming even greater. And I think, sort of moving forward, you can only see that getting more and more of a challenge, given the economics that we're all living in, and the way, the issues facing the country generally.
Can I just say one more thing about reserves, Jayne? We absolutely have to have reserves, and as your commentator has said, they're important to us in terms of maintaining our resilience. But there is something around having to have reserves to the level that Stephen's just described there, where you're having to cash flow government contracts to that extent. If we have to have reserves to meet our charitable requirements, and then we have to have £500,000 on top of that to bankroll what is effectively, a government project, you have to ask yourself morally if that is a good use of charitable funds, because actually that £500,000 that Stephen is having to use to cash flow that project is money that is not being used to deliver services right now. So it's a tricky one, the reserves question. I think there's a lot of moral questions wrapped up in it.
Thanks, Alison. Sorry, James, yes.
Which is, and I remember this discussion with one individual, I'll save their blushes, when a while ago telling me about the organisation they ran, that they, in order to keep themselves going, they needed to raise £3 million a year. And I said, well, actually, part of the problem is in the way that you phrased that, because actually you need to think about how you can make £3 million a year. Yeah. Because if you just think about that you've got to go out with a begging bowl to raise it every time, you will actually be on a downward spiral. You've got to think of a different way of doing it, and find a way to develop something that delivers you £3 million a year, and of course it'll be 3.1 next year, and so on. But it is largely that culture, and it particularly picks up, I think, on all the points that's raised. But absolutely what Alison's saying, it's the use of reserves. It's a major part in that, because you have to invest for the future, but you've got to make sure that you're investing the right way and for the right things.
Yes, I think the other point. Sorry, Stephen, go ahead.
Sorry, just quickly. We celebrated, in inverted commas, 50 years this year. And I've said this a few times, the people who set this charity up would never have thought it was going to be in 50 years' time.
Yeah.
And I think all charities should look to end. The problem is, society at the minute, the distribution of wealth and the way that everything's funded, charities are actually needed more now than they ever did. And picking up on one point from what was just before regarding advocacy and raising the voice, we've got 4 key strategic objectives. Number 2 is raising our voice. And as long as I'm Chief Executive Changing Lives, we will go about fighting the people who use our services and getting their voices raised. And when some policies the central government introduce and try to push through at the moment, charities have to stand up to defend the people using our services, because if we don't, nobody else will.
Yes, I think that's an interesting point, and I think just picking up on something Barry talked about before, and this sort of also links to the point that we started with around philanthropy now being absorbed into basic need rather than adding value to people's lives. That my experience of unrestricted income is it tends to be actually used to fill the gap on restricted income, in that there is so much demand. If we use Gateshead as an example, the demand is so high for the services of the charity that unrestricted restricted income is actually delivering the same service. So actually being able to invest that back in the development of the charity is a real challenge, because it's that sort of tussle between front-end delivery and back-end development, both of which are equally important. We only have a couple of minutes left, unfortunately. I'm just going to cover a couple of points in the comments and then have a last comment from each of you, if you don't mind, please. Muriel Hart has said that she gets really irritated by the cash flow point. Why should the public sector take credit from the charitable sector? It is our taxpayers' money, especially if they're finding they're delivering frontline activities. And Leslie Talbot said that arguably charities have a greater responsibility to generate surpluses, as our service users rely upon prudent management and longevity of the charity, and reserves aren't being used to support shareholders. They should be given the freedom to invest and deliver on charitable obligations. I don't think anybody probably disagrees with that. Final point, James, if I can just ask you on this to wrap us up now. We have about a minute, so be brief.
I'll be very quick. No, I mean, first of all, I congratulate you for laying this on, because it's such an important time for this discussion. One of my favourite sayings that I got from a long time ago is the genius of the and versus the tyranny of the or. And it is really important that the charitable sector doesn't think that it's working in a silo, that it works together. And I hope that feeds back into your next seminar. But the importance of all of us working together, all of us understanding each other's issues and understanding the commerciality of everything that we do in all sectors is really important.
Thank you, James, and I can assure you I'll be quoting that at every possible opportunity. Stephen, a last word from you.
Very quickly, I think it's really important we don't give up. It's hard. I've never known as hard as this, but we have a responsibility not only to our staff group, to our volunteers, but to the 20,000 people using our services. And that's why our work changes lives. We've just got to steer our way through the difficult times that we're in now, and hope that the next few years get slightly better. But I find that.
Well, we can hope. Thank you very much, Stephen.
We can hope.
And Barry.
Yeah, I mean, all I would say is there's never been a time when charities have been needed more. And, you know, we all have to work really hard to make sure that, you know, we get through this and continue to deliver the services that are so much needed by so many people.
Well, if our audience has anything to go by, there's a lot of support for us to do that. So thank you to you all today for contributing. And a final word from you, Alison.
I think, you know, reflecting on all of the things we've talked about today, it's really hard for some of the smaller charities to provide the resource that's required to build the right type of relationships and to do the thinking that's required. But that will be the difference, I think, between, you know, survival or not. Relationships and how we work across the sectors is going to be absolutely key.
Agreed. Working together, absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you so much to our panel, James, Stephen, Barry and Alison, to you, our audience, for participation in this webinar today and contribution to our polls and offering your views. We'll look forward to our final in this, the Business of Charity series in 2 weeks' time, Monday, the 19th of November, when we'll be discussing mutual partnerships and social change, establishing how we can do exactly what's been set out for us in this webinar. So goodbye, and we hope to see you again then.
Bye.